the detail that shouldn't exist. I noticed it because it was too precise to ignore. Every weekday, without exception, I arrived at the small cafe on the corner at exactly 6:12 p.m. Not 6:10, not 6:15. I liked the certainty of it, the predictability. After years of carefully arranging my life into neat, manageable patterns, those 12 minutes past 6 were mine. That afternoon was no different, until I reached for my usual table by the window and saw the note. It was folded once, placed neatly beside the sugar jar, as if it belonged there. No name, no greeting, just a single sentence written in clean, deliberate handwriting. You're right on time again, 6:12. I stood there longer than necessary, pretending to read my phone, while my mind tried to supply a reasonable explanation. A joke, perhaps, a coincidence, someone guessing. But the feeling that rose in my chest was not amusement. It was recognition, the quiet certainty that this was not random. I ordered my coffee anyway.
Muscle memory carried me through the exchange with the barista, through the familiar sound of steaming milk and clinking cups. I sat down, unfolded the note again, and examined it as if it might change. It didn't. The rest of the cafe moved normally around me. Conversations overlapped, a couple laughed too loudly. Outside, traffic flowed in its usual impatient rhythm. No one looked at me, no one watched me, and yet the sense of being observed clung to my skin like static. I told myself what any reasonable person would. Someone must have seen me here before. Maybe I came often enough to be noticed. Maybe this was harmless. Still, when I left, I altered my route home. The next morning, I found my apartment exactly as I had left it, except for the mug drying beside the sink. I was certain I had placed it in the cabinet before going to bed, certain enough to feel my stomach tighten. That evening, I skipped the cafe entirely. I walked instead, aimlessly, checking reflections in windows, counting my steps. Nothing happened. No notes, no signs. Relief came too quickly. 3 days later, as I unlocked my door, my phone vibrated with a notification from an unknown number. You changed your routine. I wondered how long it would take. I stood in the hallway, keys still in my hand, and understood something that unsettled me far more than fear. This wasn't about where I went. It was about how well I was known. Sleep did not come easily after that message. I lay awake listening to the familiar sounds of the building, the distant hum of traffic, the occasional creak of pipes, trying to convince myself that nothing had truly changed. My door was locked. My phone was silent. My life, in theory, remained intact. Control had always been my greatest achievement. I woke at the same hour every morning, dressed in neutral colors, ate the same breakfast while standing by the kitchen counter. I avoided mirrors when I could and conversations when I couldn't. At work, I was efficient, precise, invisible in the way people learned to trust. No one asked questions about me, and I never volunteered answers. That was how I preferred it. By mid-morning, the message from the unknown number had begun to feel less like a threat and more like an irritation, an anomaly that would resolve itself if ignored. Patterns only held power when you acknowledged them. I had learned that lesson a long time ago. Still, I changed small things. I left home 10 minutes earlier. I took the stairs instead of the elevator. I sat at a different desk during lunch. Each alteration gave me a brief sense of satisfaction, as if I were reclaiming territory that had been quietly invaded. Nothing happened. No messages, no notes, no displaced objects. By the end of the day, my confidence returned, brittle but convincing. Perhaps I had overreacted. Perhaps the precision of that first note had simply struck too close to something I already carried, a sensitivity I pretended not to have. On my way home, I stopped at the grocery store, selecting items I didn't need, prolonging the errand. I watched my reflection in the freezer doors as I passed.
A woman in her late 30s stared back, composed, unremarkable, carefully assembled. No cracks, no signs of panic. That night, I washed a single cup and placed it deliberately in the cabinet. The next morning, it was on the counter again. This time, I didn't touch it. I sat at the table and studied the kitchen as if it belonged to someone else. Nothing else was disturbed. No doors unlocked, no drawers opened. Just that quiet, deliberate reminder that my sense of order was not as absolute as I believed. A memory surfaced then, uninvited, unwelcome. The sensation of making a decision because it was easier than facing the consequences of another, of telling myself it was necessary, that everyone would be better off. I pushed the thought away. Some choices, I had learned, survived only because they were never examined too closely. My life depended on that distance, on the belief that what was past could remain untouched if handled carefully enough. As I left the apartment, my phone vibrated again. No number, no greeting, just 5 words. You were always very precise. I locked the door behind me, my hand lingering on the handle, and felt something shift, not fear exactly, but the uncomfortable awareness that the life I had constructed so meticulously might have been built on a foundation that was never as solid as I'd assumed. And if someone else knew that, then my control had always been an illusion. I stopped pretending it was nothing after that. The next few days unfolded with an unsettling rhythm, each moment echoing the one before it. I altered my routine more aggressively now, left the apartment at different hours, took longer routes, skipped meals.
Stayed late at work. The kind of changes that should have broken any casual observation. They didn't. The first sign came in the form of a coffee cup. I had chosen a cafe across town, one I had visited only once before, years ago. I ordered a drink without specifying anything special, accepting whatever default the barista offered. When the cup slid across the counter, my breath caught. No sugar, extra milk, exactly how I drank it. I told myself it was coincidence. I drank it anyway, hating myself for how quickly my hands began to shake. Then came the smaller things. A bus seat still warm when I sat down. An elevator door that reopened just as I reached it, though I hadn't pressed the button. A message that arrived seconds after I changed plans, as if in response rather than anticipation. You always hesitate before deciding. You've done that since the beginning. The beginning of what, I wondered, but I already knew the answer I refused to say aloud. I began to observe the people around me with a new intensity. The man who waited for the same train every morning, the woman who walked her dog past my building at night, the quiet coworker who never seemed to leave his desk. Everyone became a possibility, a moving piece in a puzzle that refused to take shape. At home, I stopped leaving things to chance. I photographed the apartment before going to bed. I marked the position of objects, noted the time, the light, the silence. Each morning, I compared. Nothing dramatic ever changed, just enough to be noticed, just enough to be deliberate. One evening, as I reviewed the photos, I realized something that sent a slow chill through me. Whoever was doing this understood restraint. They weren't trying to frighten me. They were trying to be seen. That realization unsettled me more than any threat could have. Fear, at least, followed familiar rules. This felt intimate, patient, as if someone were waiting for me to remember something on my own. I searched old emails that night, scrolling back through years of carefully archived conversations. Names blurred together until one stopped me cold. I hadn't spoken it in a long time, not even in my thoughts. I closed the laptop. A message arrived moments later. You always close the door when it gets uncomfortable. I sat in the dark, phone glowing in my hand, and understood the truth I had been avoiding. This wasn't about surveillance. It was about familiarity, about history. Someone knew me not as I was now,
But as I had been before, I learned how to erase parts of myself. And whoever they weren't guessing. They were remembering. The name refused to leave me after that. I carried it through the following days like an object in my pocket. Small, invisible, impossible to ignore. I didn't say it out loud. I hadn't in years. Some words gained power simply by remaining unspoken.
And this was one of them. I began with the safest option, a phone call to someone who had known me before my life became what it was now. We hadn't spoken in a long time, but time had a way of softening boundaries when curiosity was involved. She recognized my voice immediately. "You never call," she said, half amused, half wary. I asked careful questions, framed them as nostalgia, as coincidence. I listened more than I spoke, letting her fill the silence the way people often did when they believed they were helping. At first, nothing. Then, casually, almost carelessly, she mentioned him. Not as a mystery, not as a tragedy, just as someone whose life had taken a different turn. "You remember what happened," she said, "after you made that decision." I ended the call soon after, my hands colder than they should have been. I didn't remember it the way she did. Or rather, I had chosen to remember it differently. In my version, there had been no real choice, just necessity. Just circumstance. I had done what made sense at the time, what anyone reasonable would have done. But memory, I was learning, was not as fixed as I once believed. That night, I pulled out a box I hadn't opened in years. It lived on the highest shelf of my closet, hidden behind winter coats I never wore. Inside were fragments of a life I'd carefully dismantled, old photographs, handwritten notes, a folded document I couldn't bring myself to unfold. In one photo, the two of us stood side by side, younger, unguarded. He was smiling at something I'd said. I remembered the moment with uncomfortable clarity, the confidence I'd felt then, the certainty that my choices were justified. I turned the photo over. There was a date written on the back, the same date that appeared in my message history, in emails I had archived without reading, in a calendar entry I had long ago deleted. The beginning. My phone vibrated. "You never liked saying my name," the message read. It made things feel too real. I didn't respond. I couldn't. Instead, I sat on the floor, surrounded by evidence of a past I had labeled resolved and set aside. The realization settled slowly, heavily. This wasn't a stranger watching me. It was someone who knew exactly where the story had started, and who understood that I had never truly finished it. I spent the next several days living inside two timelines. In one, my life continued as it always had, quiet, efficient, carefully arranged. I went to work, answered emails, nodded through conversations. I smiled when required. No one noticed anything unusual, and that familiarity was both comforting and exhausting. In the other timeline, everything I saw carried a second meaning. A phrase overheard on the street sounded like accusation. A pause in conversation felt deliberate. Even silence seemed to watch me, waiting for the moment I would finally acknowledge what I had been avoiding. I began to revisit the story I had told myself for years. In my version, I had acted responsibly. I had recognized a situation that was becoming complicated, unmanageable. I had chosen clarity over chaos, distance over entanglement. I hadn't hurt anyone, not intentionally. Any damage that followed had been unfortunate, yes, but unavoidable. That was the narrative I had rehearsed until it felt true. But when I examined it now, cracks appeared, small at first, then impossible to ignore. There were details I had softened, moments I had edited, conversations I remembered as mutual decisions were in fact one-sided. Silence I had labeled acceptance looked increasingly like resignation. The messages continued, spaced carefully, never overwhelming. You practiced that explanation a lot. You needed it to sound convincing. At night, I dreamed of unfinished conversations. I woke with the sense that I had been speaking for a long time without being heard. Each morning,
I told myself I would confront him, end this strange performance. Each morning, I found another reason to wait. I returned to the box in my closet, this time unfolding the document I had avoided. It wasn't dramatic, no official seals, just proof of a choice formalized in ink, one signature that redirected 2 lives. I had signed without hesitation. The memory unsettled me not because of what I'd done, but because of how certain I had been. Certainty, I was realizing, was often a form of self-protection. My phone buzzed again, late in the evening. "I didn't watch you to scare you," he wrote. "I watched because I wanted to understand how easily you moved on." That was when the truth finally surfaced, sharp and unavoidable. I hadn't been observed all these years. I had been spared. He hadn't intruded on my life until now because he hadn't needed to. My absence from his had been enough. This was not revenge. It was a reckoning delayed. I typed a response for the first time,
deleting it twice before sending a single sentence. "What do you want from me?" The reply came almost immediately. "For you to tell the story without leaving anything out." I stared at the screen, aware that the version of myself I had lived with for so long could not survive that request. And perhaps that was the point. We agreed to meet without ever saying the word meet. The message arrived the next morning with nothing more than a location and a time. No explanation, no questions. I recognized the place immediately, a public park near the river, quiet during the week, overlooked by office buildings that never quite paid attention to what happened below. I arrived early. Of course I did. The bench faced the water, just as it always had. I sat with my hands folded in my lap, watching the slow movement of the current, rehearsing what I might say. Every version sounded either defensive or hollow. I discarded them all. He didn't approach from behind. He never would have done that.
When he sat down beside me, there was no drama in it, no anger, no hesitation. He looked older, thinner, shaped by a life I had not witnessed. For a brief, disorienting moment, I felt relief, not fear, as if something suspended for years had finally landed. "I didn't want to scare you," he said quietly. "I just needed you to notice." I nodded, unable to meet his eyes. He explained without accusation. He spoke of time passing unevenly, of rebuilding something from fragments, of watching my life from a distance, not obsessively, not constantly, but enough to know that I had been fine, better than fine. "I wondered if you ever thought about it," he said, "about me." I told him the truth, that I had, but only in the way people think about closed doors, briefly and always from the outside. I had convinced myself that revisiting it would serve no purpose. He smiled at that, not kindly, not cruelly. "That was the difference," he said. "You got to close it." I finally looked at him then, and the weight of it settled fully in my chest. This wasn't about the messages, or the notes, or the patterns. Those had been a language I understood. Precision, restraint, familiar rules. This was about acknowledgement. "I never wanted your life," he continued. "I just wanted you to see what yours cost." There was nothing to argue with in that. No defense left that didn't sound like an excuse. I told him what I had avoided saying even to myself, that I had chosen what was easiest for me and called it necessary, that I had mistaken decisiveness for courage, that I had moved forward because stopping would have required me to sit with the consequences. He listened. He didn't interrupt. When I finished, he stood. That's all I needed. The truth. Without edits. He walked away without looking back. I remained on the bench long after he was gone, understanding at last that the observation had never been the punishment. It had been the invitation.
I thought the meeting would be the end of it. For a few days, it almost was. No messages, no signs. The quiet returned, tentative and unfamiliar, like a room after furniture has been moved. I went through my routines again, but they no longer fit the way they used to. Each action felt slightly misaligned, as if performed by someone rehearsing a role she no longer believed in. The confession had not ended when he walked away. It followed me. I replayed my words constantly, hearing not what I had said, but what I had left unsaid even then. Truth, I was discovering, was not a single act of honesty. It was a process, and I had only begun. One evening, unable to stay inside my apartment any longer, I walked aimlessly through the city. I passed familiar streets without recognizing them, my thoughts circling the same realization. I had spent years protecting myself from discomfort, calling it survival, when it had really been avoidance.
My phone vibrated as I crossed the bridge near the park. "You don't owe me anything else," the message read. "But you owe it to yourself to stop pretending." I stopped walking. This was the confession he hadn't asked for, the one that didn't require a witness, the one I could no longer postpone. I sat on a low concrete wall overlooking the water and let the memory unfold without interruption for the first time. Not the polished version, not the justified one, the real sequence of events, the hesitation, the calculation, the moment I realized I could walk away and chose to do exactly that. I remembered how relieved I had felt afterward, how light, how quickly relief had turned into habit. I whispered the truth aloud, my voice barely audible over the sound of the river. I had known it would hurt him. I had known the consequences would last. I had simply decided they were not mine to carry. The admission landed heavily, but it didn't destroy me. Instead,
Something else happened. Something quieter, more unsettling. The need to defend myself dissolved. Without that constant effort, there was space for something I had avoided for years: accountability. I typed a message slowly, deliberately. I told myself I was being strong, I wrote. I wasn't. I was being careful with my own comfort. The reply came after a long pause. "That's the part I needed you to see." There was no reconciliation promised, no forgiveness offered, just that acknowledgement, suspended between us, complete and irreversible. I went home that night and slept without dreams for the first time in weeks. In the morning, the apartment felt different, not safer, not lighter, but honest. The mug was still in the cabinet where I had placed it. Nothing had moved. For the first time, I understood that the reckoning was no longer waiting for me somewhere outside. It had already arrived. The days that followed were unremarkable in every visible way. No messages arrived.
No notes appeared. The subtle disturbances that had once punctuated my life with unease were gone, as if they had never existed. If someone were to look at me now, they would see the same woman moving through the same routines, occupying the same spaces. Only I knew how much had shifted. Without the sense of being observed, I expected relief. Instead, I felt exposed in a different way, alone with thoughts I could no longer redirect or silence. There was no external presence to focus on, no mystery to solve, just the quiet, persistent awareness of myself. I returned to the cafe one evening, arriving at 6:12 without intending to. The habit was still there, ingrained deeper than I realized. I sat at the same table by the window and ordered my coffee. When it came, I studied it for a moment before taking a sip. It tasted the same. The difference was not in the world around me, but in the way I occupied it. I no longer scanned the room for signs.
I no longer waited for something to happen. The anticipation that had once filled every pause was gone, replaced by something heavier and more grounded: responsibility. I thought of him often, but not with the urgency of fear or the hope of resolution. He had stepped back into his own life, carrying his version of the truth, as I now carried mine. There was no symmetry in that, and there didn't need to be. Some things could be acknowledged without being repaired. At home, my apartment remained unchanged. The box from the closet stayed on the shelf, unopened but no longer hidden. I didn't feel the need to destroy it or preserve it with care. It existed, and that was enough. One night, as I stood by the window watching the city settle into darkness, it occurred to me that this was the first time in years I wasn't managing a narrative. I wasn't explaining myself, to others or to me. The absence of that effort was unsettling, but it was also honest. I had not been punished.
I had not been redeemed. I had been seen, and then left to live with what that meant. The realization followed quietly, without drama. Being unobserved did not mean being free. Freedom, I was learning, came with the weight of memory intact, without distortion or defense. I turned off the light and stood in the dark for a moment longer, listening to the steady sounds of a life continuing. No one was watching anymore, and for the first time, I understood that this was not a release. It was a responsibility I would carry forward, deliberately, every day.